This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer at a beverage manufacturing plant, he starts his day knowing every line is ready to run because Grainger delivers the industrial-grade products he needs to keep mixers, conveyors, and packaging equipment moving. With Grainger's vast selection of bearings, belts, and motors, he keeps operations running smoothly, so nothing grinds to a halt. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Kieran Boyle, the Ravens lost out on going to the playoffs and indeed winning the division last year by dint of a missed field goal by Tyler Loop at Pittsburgh, which would have changed the trajectory of both teams, although maybe they wouldn't have, would have still ended up in the same place they were. The Steelers went to the playoffs, Julie lost in the playoffs, and then parted company with head coach Mike Tomlin. The Ravens have brought in Jesse Minter, who is just about as highly touted a coaching candidate as we've seen in recent years, maybe with the exception of Ben Johnson in last season's coaching carousel. Jesse Minter was the guy that a lot of people were saying, that's the one you want. That's the culture guy. That's the scheme guy. That's the new version of Mike Macdonald. Indeed, you know, they both have shared a college, they shared a college gig there. And Macdonald went to see how Minter had improved on what he left behind him. Such was his respect for what Jesse Minter has done on the defensive side of the ball. Doesn't necessarily always follow that the great coordinator becomes a head coach, and we've seen many examples of that. But so far, so good in Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean it's a nice pickup for him. I mean, obviously the Ravens' loss is the Giants' gain with Harbaugh moving the other way. I think for everybody, it was time for a change with the Ravens. I mean, you could see the strain kind of showing on Harbaugh over the last year or two. It was definitely starting to drain him with the expectations and the kind of Lamar heavy expectations that they had on the offense. I mean, Minter's a nice pickup. He's done some great things with the Chargers, but again, unproven. And you're coming into an AFC North that gets pretty brutal. There's no more, 80-degree days in LA. It's going to be a lot of cold, by the lake, smash mouth, muddy football come November in Cleveland and Pittsburgh. So, he's going to earn his chops pretty quickly when he's going to learn where he is. A tough season last year for the Ravens. They started 1-5 and they just couldn't scrap it back. And like we said, that was pretty much it for Harbaugh. The writing was on the wall. The other issue, I mean, only getting 13 games out of Lamar. Lamar is obviously the straw that stirs the drink. And kind of like Burrow, if he's not out there, conducting things, it makes things hugely difficult. Linderbaum goes out the door. Obviously, they're going to have a little bit more of a revamped O-line. Oliva Vega comes in from Penn State. We'll see how he works out. Trey Hendrickson, he comes in, and we'll see, obviously, the addition he'll turn out to be. But again, you look across the field, it's Lamar and it's Derrick Henry. And if they're firing on all cylinders, then it's a great watch. I mean, I think we can all be honest that the AFC North can suffer a little bit with not being the kind of snazziest and juiciest division to watch, albeit Derrick Henry and Lamar. But, when the Ravens are cooking, it's a great watch. But they're going to look for bigger years from a lot of key players. Obviously, they've lost Likely. They lost Pat Ricard. And they're going to look for another big year from Mark Andrews, solidifying now that, I mean, if we want to call it a tight end one position, I mean, the guy only had a career low of 422 receiving yards last year. So he's going to want to build on that. But I mean, is Derrick Henry going to be what he was last year, the year before, and in all his career? That's another 1,000+ yards on the clock. And, is he going to be able to produce as he has been over the course of his career? That's a big question too. You look on the defense. I mean, the defense is at a rough one last year, but you look around and it can be fixed pretty quickly. I mean, you look at the secondary alone. You have four first rounders in that secondary: Nate Wiggins, Kyle Hamilton, Malachi Starks, and Marlon Humphrey. So that can get fixed real quick once they stay in the field. Obviously, you bring in Trey Hendrickson. There's huge questions about Madubuike, whether he'll play this year. He's a big addition, or he'll be a big loss if he's not around. So a lot of variables in Baltimore. Obviously, it starts from the head coach, how he kind of instills his philosophy into this team and how quickly they take it up. But I mean, Lamar had a somewhat, not really a down year because he wasn't on the field as much as usual, but production-wise, he's going to have to help that run game because Derrick Henry can't do it himself. Justice Hill, I don't care what anybody says, Justice Hill is a big drop-off from a running back like Derrick Henry. So a lot of question marks. They finished 8-9 last year. It could be something hovering around that again in 26 because of the loss that they've had personnel-wise and big questions about if Lamar and Derrick can just keep that train on the track. But it's all about Minter and Lamar. Can Minter can he instill what he wants to do quickly enough for them to keep pace with the rest of the North? Because, the weather does get dirty once October hits, and the conditions can get pretty harsh. And, he's going to have to adapt to that pretty quickly. It's not going to be SoFi and 73 degrees indoors anymore.
Brian, just picking up on that thread, I mean, for all that Minter was a sought-after coaching candidate in the offseason, very highly rated around the league from his time with the Chargers and also from his college career, as I mentioned, as Kieran is beginning to talk about there are also risks. I mean, the Ravens could have stood pat with Harbaugh and gone to run it back again, and they decided to freshen things up. But you're bringing in Jesse Minter as a first-time head coach. His offensive coordinator he brought in from Ben Johnson's staff in Chicago, actually, Declan Doyle. Declan Doyle's never called plays in the NFL before, and at 30, he will be the youngest play caller in the NFL next season. Lamar Jackson raving about what he's seen so far in training, but you're installing a new offense, you're bringing in a new OC. That can take time to bed in. You got a new defensive coordinator, you got a new defensive-minded head coach coming in. It's not necessarily all going to click from day one in Baltimore, and you're going to start to see the argument for why didn't we keep our well-oiled machine going if they drop a couple of games early on.
Yeah, I think initially his immediate piece, I think as you said, he's a defensive-minded coach. He'll look at the defense of last year, 18th in points allowed, 24th in yards allowed. That's not what we've seen over the course of the last 10 years under Harbaugh. We were seeing the upper echelons, top 10, and teams predominantly the Ravens over the course of the years. You always think of how strong they are defense. It wasn't the case last year. I guess he will have to trust his people that he's brought in to manage the offense. I think that's like he focuses his part on the defense, which you could argue was kind of similar in a way with Seattle when they went in initially. They got that Seahawks defense back to what we saw years ago when they were really challenging to win Super Bowls under Pete Carroll. I think there's a part of the NFL where, unfortunately, it comes a time when there's a case of like, should we transition into a new coach, and when is the right time to call a spade, and call that time. 18 years for John Harbaugh, numerous years in the playoffs, but it was evident over the course of the last season, in particular, that things are right. I'm not going to suggest that things weren't right between him and Lamar, but it just felt like there was this kind of parting of the ways coming, and there was always this kind of, not necessarily disgruntlement, but you always felt there was kind of an underlying issue there between them, and it was probably predominantly on speculation, but it just felt like over the last couple of years, things didn't feel right. And offensively, it didn't seem right. Lamar's been injured. The fact that they've gone offensive line a number of times in the draft, and, trying to make sure Lamar's kept up right. I think they're still ruining a little bit from that year, kind of where they really felt like they were the team to go and win the Super Bowl, the one in which we went to in Vegas. They lost that AFC Championship game. I don't think they fully ever recovered from that. I think that loss was significant. They were the number one seed. They went into it as heavy favorites in that game, lost. There were so many mistakes riddled in that game, and I still think back to that game.
It's funny you say that, Brian, because you could also make a similar argument for the Detroit Lions last season. It really did seem like they suffered a hangover from coming so close to get to the Super Bowl and falling agonizingly short. Like, it's a short season in the NFL, as we know, and a relatively short off season, considering how combative the sport is. It doesn't give teams an awful lot of time to shake off or recover, particularly when you're losing parts of the off season. If you go to the playoffs, that is a hangover that they seem to have, and particularly the manner in which they lost with the Mark Andrews drop.
Yeah, so just on Mark Andrews, sorry, we'll come to the nature of that, but like, his numbers are starting, and you think about where Ravens fans were disgruntled by likely leaving in free agency. They kind of felt like he was transitioning into tight end one as opposed to Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews' production levels, as I said, dropped off last year. I just feel like the Harbaugh thing ultimately for me kind of was, there were so many losses, so many near opportunities to make it all the way. And like that, you touched on that AFC playoff game in Buffalo. Even last season, week 1, do you right the wrongs of that game against Buffalo immediately on the Sunday Night Football? Well, you kind of do until the third quarter when you give away such a heavy lead. There was numerous games where they're up by 10 plus points. I'm kind of feel like I'm shooting my own new head coach down, but like unfortunately for the Ravens, there was so many times it was all there in front of them and they lost. And that's a great comparison in terms of the Lions, because like the Lions lose that divisional round game to the Commanders. Everyone felt they'd come back last year, lights out, and win that division. It wasn't the case. They lose the defensive coordinator, they lose the offensive coordinator, and now you've got a Ravens team which are very different demographic in terms of offensive coordinator, defensive minded head coach. It either all come together very well, and the Ravens will be back challenging, or we might just see that kind of middle of the road season. It's hard to know with this team right now.
Kieran, as Brian has pointed out, the Ravens get so many things right, and yet we've looked at some of the flaws in their stars, if you like, over the last couple of seasons play out very publicly. Lamar maybe not stepping up to the plate. I know they bristle in Baltimore at any suggestion that he may not be the guy for the big high-pressure playoff situation, but until we see him do it, there'll always be that question mark there. The Mark Andrews drop, the Tyler Loop miss, that they failed to pull out the win and top the division as they should have done, with their rivals creaking all around them last year. But also, and Brian alluded to it there, they've thrown away more double-digit leads under the Harbaugh leadership than any other team in NFL history. There's something funny, despite them drafting so well, being so well run objectively as a franchise, that seems to prevent them from getting it done when it really, really matters.
Yeah, I feel like this is a team that are perennially in our conversation for Super Bowl contenders, and they have been for the last 4 or 5 years consistently. And yeah, they have flattered to deceive, and they've just failed to live up to the hype so many times. And yeah, you mentioned all those big players, Mark Andrews, Lamar Jackson. You talked about Tyler Loop, Zay Flowers, even in the against the Chiefs a few years ago, and his couple of slip ups. But I add Derrick Henry and a few fumbles, a few costly fumbles into the mix there. And, giving up those leads, you wonder exactly, as Brian said, is that a contributing factor to the fact that they needed to freshen things up at head coach? And it's interesting that you mentioned the young offensive coordinator Doyle coming in there as well, because I think he's got a huge role to play. Just going back to what you talked about, I echo what you said about Jesse Minter. I do believe, and I get what Kieran is saying about the different conditions, but again, he's a guy who coached a top 5 defense last year. You saw what they missed in the absence of Mike McDonald and what the Seahawks gained. So they will hope that they'll get back to that they'll right that ship, because the talent from top to bottom on that defense is huge. I know they brought back another guy worth mentioning is Calais Campbell. I know it's a 39-year-old Calais Campbell, but what he might add to that locker room, and if you can get a tune out of him, he's somebody who can solidify that locker room as well. I think they're going to be just fine defensively. I think offensively, it's those questions in those big moments. Can they close it out? Can they finish? And one thing that's kind of frustrated me about the Ravens in the last couple of years is when you look at Lamar Jackson and you look at Derrick Henry, and we talked about that two-headed monster on offense. And if it's running smoothly, they should be almost undefendable when the two of them are at full strength. But I've questioned the clarity of roles. Who is supposed to be taking up the mantle in the right spot? Because you saw Derrick Henry, a guy who was so reliable, as I said, have some costly fumbles. I've seen moments in games where I thought they just got to put the ball in Lamar's hands here and he's just got to keep the ball and just do RPO, because we've seen him just run teams to death, and then when they had to fill the box, just throw the dagger. But I feel like they've messed that up on so many occasions in big games that you just didn't know who the big player was supposed to be, who was supposed to be carrying the ball. I question, have they got the strongest receiving core either? I don't know whether Rashad Bateman or Zay Flowers fill me with confidence. They're the two doubts I would have with this offense. But as I said, we got this young offensive coordinator coming in from the Ben Johnson tree, if there is such thing as a Ben Johnson tree, but you'd have to imagine he'd have a few tricks up his sleeve as well. And you'd love to think that he can get the best out of these two players. You really want to find out what Derrick Henry has left in the tank. I know he's a guy that minds himself physically very, very well. You wouldn't necessarily worry about his age, but he's a lot of miles on the clock. So it's another team that really should be challenging for the division and beyond. But you just really want to see, you want to see Minter, if you're a Ravens fan, Minter come in and do his thing and do what he has to do with the defense. and just get that clarity of roles, and that slickness back on offense. And I think that, again, another team that could be very dangerous.